Hello, everyone, and welcome to CULTIVATE by Collaborative Solutions, which brings together business and industry leaders providing insights to drive innovation. In this panel, we'll be discussing building a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy for lasting change. We're excited to spend this next hour with you. I mean, we know you could be anywhere, right? But you decided to spend it with us, and we're so grateful. My name is Alex Prasis. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Collaborative Solutions. We have a fantastic conversation for you today. I'm joined by two incredible industry leaders who have navigated DEI and are here today to share their perspective and insights. This session is being recorded and will be shared with you via email after this event. As a reminder, you are on mute, so if you have any questions for the panelists throughout the conversation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And please ask questions. We want this to be an engaging event that really you walk away from feeling very empowered. You can also access the chat button to converse with other attendees during this event. And again, encourage you to do so. So if you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, feel free to pop in your name, your pronouns, your LinkedIn, and connect with each other. So without further ado, please help me welcome our panelists for our conversation today. David Jones, Chief Human Resources Officer at Stanford Healthcare, and Shamika Young, VP and Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Cognizant. I would love for each of you to introduce yourselves and share with us what's one thing in the past year you've observed to be a major pivot in the field of DEI. So I'm going to go ahead and start with David. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what is the major pivot that you've seen?
Good morning, Alex, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this program. I am the Chief Human Resource Officer with Stanford Healthcare. I've been here 4 years now. I have been leading human resources for many organizations, primarily healthcare, for the last 30 years and really driving change and transformation. And I've been delighted to do that at Stanford here lately. And I tell you, the issues here today are I think at a level that we've not seen before, certainly because of the pandemic, the social justice climate, the political climate. So many things I think have come together to make this a unique moment. We're almost on the anniversary of the George Floyd video, and that video was a shot heard around the world. And I think it really galvanized a collective outrage that to some extent, I don't know that we've ever seen before. The folks who measure sentiment will tell us that the level of support, advocacy, and alignment and outrage around the issues of police violence and the impact on the Black community reached a level that they've never measured before, and that every demographic group was at the same level of outrage, concern, and commitment to seeing change. Now, some of those numbers have moved a bit, but just to have that level of alignment really was catalyzing in so many ways. And so we've seen a response in various sectors across our society to try to identify and address these issues of equity, of justice within our organizations and our society, communities, within policing, many other areas. I think as I look at this, and as many of my friends and colleagues ask ourselves, will this be different? Is this different? Because we've seen some of this before with other videos, other areas where there has been outrage, and in most cases, it fizzled out over time and there was no real lasting change. And so the question we've been asking is, will this be different? And if so, why? And I think one of the things I'm seeing that is different is the level of accountability that is coming from so many directions, from boards and within organizations, through public policy, through federal policy. We're seeing it happen in so many ways where we are building in the infrastructure, much more resourcing, much more accountability, much more focus and alignment on these issues, where I think there will be a longer term focus and commitment. So for me, the mobilization that I'm seeing now encourages me that perhaps this could be different, that we are on the right path.
Thank you, David. And yeah, I mean, that catalyst for change, really powerful. And we're going to talk about accountability in a little bit. We're going to expand on that conversation. But right now I'm going to transition over to Shamika. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you believe to be the major pivot.
Yeah, so my name is Shamika Young. My pronouns are she and her. And, I do want to start off just by saying, from a global standpoint, I think David was dead on that there was really the shot heard around the world. And I think it has helped us to become more inclusive and thoughtful overall. And so one of the things I did want to just call out with the current situation that's going on in India with just rampant COVID situation there, anyone that's on the call here that has, family, friends, colleagues, certainly my thoughts are with you all as just, this is a humanitarian effort of what we need to do to help one another. And so I think the George Floyd situation helped as well to create some of that catalyst of just awareness. And so for me, I think it was the introspection and education that has now kind of come forward based on that environment. Last summer and even into the fall, we saw that the top books from Amazon, from Barnes and Noble, across New York Times, were really about race and justice. And people were really trying to seek what they could do themselves to understand more, to really start from that seek understanding first, maybe rethink and unlearn what they had experienced before, maybe acknowledge that they had never really fully understood the dynamics and the history of some of the individuals in our country, certainly within the US. And so I think that introspection, that education, that continued view now of we have to do better because we know better, we're learning better, we have the tools to know how to take this forward. We just now need to take these things into action. And the accountability factor is, I think, a remarkable shift in where we have been before from platitudes.
Thank you, Shamika. And yeah, I mean, that education piece, really that first step, but now, it's great to see moving from education to action, which we'll also talk about today as well. So getting into that accountability topic, what's been made clear across industries this past year is that DEI is no longer this, nice to have in an employer branding type thing, but it's really an imperative for organizational success, and accountability is being enforced on an elevated level. For instance, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, is pushing companies for greater ethnic and gender diversity for their boards and workforces, and actually says they'll vote against directors who fail to act. While accountability in terms of diversity is, absolutely important, we know that it must be in tandem with efforts around equity and inclusion. So what I want to ask you both is, what key steps do you believe organizations need to take to break down old barriers and progress towards a more equitable and inclusive workplace? I'd like to start with Shamika here.
Yeah, great question, Alex. I think, everyone is on a different journey. And so we have to recognize kind of where people are. But I think one of the ways to accelerate that journey is to start with the data and then to make the data align to performance management metrics. Because everyone in every business and organization is held accountable to something. Of those things that you're held accountable to, make this a critical piece. For me, my team and I, we look at data and what it tells us across the different demographics of our organization. And so we use that data to evaluate hypotheses, break those down, determine, does a woman have the same experience as a male, right? Do people in different organizations have different experiences? But to hold then the leadership accountable with those metrics regarding annual performance with quarterly checkpoints, I think is something that has immediately made that awareness move from just education to actual action and outcome. So I absolutely would start with, do you know what your data is telling you? If you don't, come up with 3 to 5 hypotheses of what you want to validate. And then once you know what that data is telling you, then look at the avenues to hold individuals accountable with the proper metrics.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and you're just talking about it from the starting point, right? But, we get into the programs and measuring success. I mean, if you don't have that starting point, you're not going to kind of know the success of your efforts, right? So thank you, Shamika. David, would like to kind of hear from you about, your thoughts on breaking down barriers.
Sure. I love what Shamika said, and I think the data and the current state assessment is critical to know where you are. You can't know where you need to go if you don't know where you are. I would take one step back and say that for many organizations, I think really the first question to ask and answer is why? Why are we doing this? Why is this important to us? What is driving us? Is this about compliance? Is it because of external pressure? Is it because we feel that there is a business imperative? Or do we feel that there is a moral imperative? And is this about doing the right thing? Do we have a sense of what this means to our workforce as far as the employee experience or our ability to engage, attract, and retain the workforce we need? I think the more a leadership team can be really, really clear about the why and what their motivation is and what's really driving them, I think that will really help determine whether or not they sustain their focus. Because if it's about external pressure, well, when that pressure goes away, does that mean you go back to the way things were? Or if it's about just hitting a number or a metric and you hit that number, then do you stop? Or is it really about something deeper in terms of even a personal sense of what's right and wrong and your own awareness and education, as Shamika was talking about earlier, on your own journey? I think when people come at this from that personal point of view and really awaken to the sense of what's right and wrong, what is just and unjust, and how they can make a difference, to me, that's really the more sustainable long-term change that we can see for organizations and for individuals. And so I think starting there as a leadership team can align around that is probably the most powerful step. And then from there, getting the data, finding out where you are, setting priorities, putting structures in place, looking for quick wins, and starting to move things forward.
Yeah, you bring up that excellent point around leadership buy-in. And one part of that, of course, is accountability. But that's, when we talk about change management, right, that's only going to go so far, knowing that, there'll be repercussions if you don't succeed in this area, but really having, the leadership intrinsically motivated, around this is just, just makes it kind of that much more effective, successful, and really just reverberates throughout the organization for that why. So right now, what I'd love to do is actually get all of our audience involved a little bit more. So we want to hear from you. You're going to see a question on the screen. Go ahead and use your phone or computer. Go to menti.com and type in the code you see at the top of the screen. So the question: what does your organization struggle with when it comes to DEI? I know that's quite broad. Maybe you're thinking of a million things or nothing because it's just so broad. So some ideas, right? Maybe it's around representation itself, whether that be recruiting and hiring, whether that be in retention, or maybe it's lack of equitable systems to promote career development. Perhaps, we talked about leadership before. Maybe it's a lack of leadership buy-in or accountability. We'd really love to hear from you what you're experiencing in your organizations. So hopefully we can touch on those items in the rest of this discussion if we haven't already. Hey, data seems to be a big one. So I know, Shamika touched on it a little bit as well as David, but we could definitely kind of thread that through, what we're talking about later. I know one thing, with data is a lot of times, to start with, you don't necessarily have a lot of data to understand what your gaps are. So kind of, digging into, Shamika mentioned the hypotheses, right? But like digging into what are some of those things that you could be looking at, representation itself, absolutely. Resources, yes, definitely key to, organizational success, knowledge, recruiting. I'm seeing some of these other kind of words come in here. I see buy-in. Knowledge seems to be getting a little bit bigger. So that seems to be something that, perhaps is lacking, all around for a number of reasons, right? Not just specific to the organization, but, perhaps just, as a society, right? Lacking in that education, understanding, dialogue. Great. So these are some really, really great items to kind of think through as we're going through the rest of our discussion. So thank you everyone for participating. As I mentioned earlier, keep the conversation going on in the chat, feel free to kind of talk with each other about things you're experiencing. And then if you have any questions for us, please don't hesitate to pop something in the Q&A chat. We want, again, we want you to walk away from this feeling like you're empowered. So if you have a question, don't hesitate to ask it. We would love to take a look and see if we can help you with that. So we will go ahead and, jump into the next question. So we want to talk about next, and it does kind of relate to what we're talking about with organizational struggles. What are some initiatives your organization is implementing to support the progress towards a more equitable and inclusive workplace? And, within that, I think, one of the things that was talked about in this poll was knowledge. And oftentimes the knowledge can be overwhelming. A lot of these, educational pieces are brand new information for a lot of people. So oftentimes people get kind of stuck on that change curve between knowledge and action. So within those initiatives, how are you effectively moving people from knowledge to action, motivating without overwhelming? So I want to start with David first. Would love to hear about initiatives your organization is implementing in supporting that progress towards a more equitable and inclusive workplace.
Thank you, Alex. So for Stanford, we really decided to swing for the fences on this and really began the dialogue about a year ago as to how we wanted to respond, and really made the decision to create this Equity and Justice Commission. And this commission is made up of some external national leaders. Some of them are leaders politically, or they're DEI leaders from large corporations, or they are maybe prominent folks at law firms or other universities. And they're helping give oversight along with a panel of internal stakeholders. And this group has been working now for several months, starting with collecting data, interviewing stakeholders, getting information, really understanding the imperative for Stanford Healthcare as to what's going on here within our environment. What are the issues and challenges people are dealing with? What do the numbers tell us? Back to the data question, where are the gaps? And what are the things that we most need to address in order to ensure that we meet our mission? For us as a healthcare organization, a big part of this is not only about our workforce and their experience, but also about our patients. And we were disturbed to learn how many of our patients of color, Black patients in particular, perceive that they're not getting the right outcomes, that they're being treated differently, that they are experiencing in some cases some level of verbal comment or abuse, or that in some respects the treatment that they're getting isn't up to par for other people. And we have some evidence to support that. And so the more we dug into that and learned about health inequities stemming from our own system, that became another work stream from this Social Justice Commission. And so now we've moved through the assessment and data gathering, and now we're bringing forward a whole list of reports from this commission that really will set a 3 to 5 year plan for the organization to really focus on addressing and correcting these issues. And there's lots that we've built in here as far as a commitment to resources, commitment to certain representational statistics, hiring and leadership roles, training, coaching, mentorship, commitment to trainees, to pipelines. I mean, it's pretty comprehensive, and it was designed to be so. And what I like about it is that it really does galvanize our leadership across our enterprise around what's really going to be critical and important. We'll be measuring this in multiple ways. And we, again, designed it so that we would have that external lens and view on this work, so that it's not just our own internal organization, but we've identified this outside panel who will be monitoring and watching our results over time. So it's a pretty big commitment. And I think we've designed this also in a way that people will be able to be engaged and involved. And I think back to your point of how you move people to action, it is giving them something they can actually do, giving them a place they can plug in and connect, giving them tools and activities where they can make a difference. And whether that's by being an ally, whether that's by participating on a task force, whether that's by being part of a dialogue forum or group or book club, whatever it might be, but really giving each person a place where they can step to the plate, take on some accountability, and jump into the game.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm really excited to kind of see the progress of that. And, you know, you kind of touched on that connection to, you know, the business consumer, so to speak, right? And really kind of put some like meaning to people's jobs too, and why we're here and who we're supporting, to kind of give some of that why around this, which I think is really incredible. And, you know, talking about, you know, moving from knowledge to action, that tie-in to make people feel like, you know, their support of this, you know, has such bigger repercussions. It's really incredible. So thank you for sharing that. I'd imagine we might have some follow-up questions in the chat on that, which I'll be excited to dive into. So before we do that, Shamika, you know, would love to hear about what your organization is doing, and, you know, anything around that, you know, the things we've been talking about, moving people to action. You know, please would love to know, more about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, David called out a few really good points that certainly we align to with things that we were doing at Cognizant. I think the first being that assessment and benchmarking exercise. It's extremely critical to just kind of know where you sit, right? So after you've answered the question of the why, as he so eloquently kind of called out before, then where do you sit? How do you compare? And I think doing those exercises just helps everyone have that consistent baseline from a leadership perspective. One thing that you said earlier in your question that I thought was really interesting, and I try to push our leaders based on kind of which categories they fit into in a little bit of a different way, was around the overwhelming piece. How do you move people forward without overwhelming? Depending on the leader, I actually will overwhelm them sometimes, because I actually have, I'd say, quite a bit of experience with some of our core leaders. When you can push them harder and help them see the stress of what the environment is actually not allowing us to live up to, they actually perform much faster. And so, you know, it's, you know, kind of akin to, you know, we don't really grow as much as possible until we're all really stretched. And I think, you know, with the George Floyd situation, everyone was stretched at once. And so we now have a bit more commonality in that perspective. So we've leveraged that in some really good ways to help leaders think more aggressively in how they can change behaviors, drive more inclusion. I saw on the Mentimeter, inclusion was a small component. It actually is one of the more significant components, because it requires a lot of behavior change. So to answer your question, we've looked at initiatives in a few different ways. The first is around the employee experience. Because we are such a large company with populations of people that go and deliver to clients every day, having an understanding of how people move across hiring, promotion, and retention are critically valuable for us. So being able to have that career velocity view is a baseline piece that we look at. And so we're looking at our initiatives that way to say, you know, how have we progressed our hiring? One thing we immediately did last year was we stood up more of a Rooney Rule kind of adjusted process, right? And so for those of you that don't know, Rooney Rule is a process that started with the NFL some years ago to bring in more diverse talent at the coaching level initially, and then into the office. And it actually was not successful. And so what we did was we evaluated what were the factors that made it not successful, and how could we proactively adjust those things. And so what we looked at was not just identifying one diverse candidate for slates, but actually a higher percentage of diverse candidates across the slates. Because what data told us is that when you only have one different person, they never get hired, right? So if you have a team of 5 and you have one different person, that person almost never gets hired. So we increased those percentages. The other part of that is we knew that we needed to have more diverse interviewers. So if, as a woman, if I'm going to interview somewhere and I interview with 10 men, they can be fantastic. I still will want to know, does your organization have any women? And so just making sure that we had the full employee or prospective employee experience laid out was something critically important to us. So that's one primary initiative that we've looked at. The other, on the retention side, has really been engaging our affinity groups in a much more intentional way, surveying them specifically to understand what are the things that they need as affinity group members in order to stay engaged. What type of sponsorship do they need? What does allyship really look like for them on their day-to-day work and performing well for our clients? So that was another component to the employee experience. And then just to kind of close it off was the client side. As David called out, the patient side, right? That consumer end. For us, it's clients and how we serve our clients. And what I ask our client partners and our account managers to do is really evaluate, how do you show up to that client? Do you have an understanding of where they are on their D&I journey? Are there things that we can actually do together to help us become, more cohesive in trying to move this humanitarian, effort forward, right? But a lot of that goes back to, where people are on their journey, as well as what their why is. So if they're doing it for compliance and just to check the box, you won't get the level of engagement and inclusiveness that you really desire. But if they're doing it because it's the right thing to do from a business imperative, it creates greater performance outcomes, greater productivity, greater innovation, then we have a lot to work with. But I think there's so many opportunities, to move the needle across initiatives. It goes back to evaluate your own, company data, your organizational data, and decide, where can I make the change in the most aggressive and impactful way possible.
Thank you, Shamika. And, you touched on, a few things that maybe our audience members weren't aware of, right? That the Rooney Rule actually hasn't been successful, and diverse interview panels have actually found to be, when they're done right, very successful in bringing in a more diverse pool of candidates and hiring them. So, I think that's, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's, just a really powerful way that, that doesn't take, a ton of money, movement. That's something that you can start doing in your department group and share with people about, how are we approaching interviewing, and then the inclusion piece, right? Like we've been talking about, we can definitely have the accountability around diversity, but, if we bring in, all different people, right? If we bring in Black and Latinx employees, but we don't have a space for them that they feel like they can be their authentic selves, that really kind of welcomes and has equitable systems for career development, they're going to leave. Right. So, it's really important that that equity and inclusion piece is always considered, within the broader, diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. So before I have another question. I do want to dig into that data a bit more, just because I know our audience really wants to kind of learn more about that. But David, we actually had a question come in from Anita Thornton. She asked, was economic status considered as far as outcomes for the initiative that you all are doing at Stanford?
I did see that question. I'm not exactly sure fully what it's referencing. Certainly, when we looked at our patients, we recognize that socioeconomic status is a big factor in the type of care people get. And that's both from an access point of view, that's both having the right insurance coverages, but it's also the perception that caregivers have when a person comes into our system. I would hate to admit some of what we've learned about some of the bias that plays into when a person shows up in the ER, for example, versus if they're admitted through a primary care physician. And we've had, in some cases, prominent Black people who've come into the ER and where the caregivers interpreted their behavior as drug seeking or otherwise, and steered them down a completely different path than they would have for other patients with similar presenting circumstances and symptoms. And we've been able to track and measure some of that and see how the perception of that physician or caregiver can have a huge impact on ultimately the type of care people receive. One of these people actually is an African-American man who runs a company here in the Bay Area and who is now our board chairman coming into the next cycle. And the story he's told other board members about his own experience was just hair raising, as far as had his wife not been there, who's a nurse, and was able to advocate for him. The drugs he was prescribed and the treatment he was given was completely, it was based on a presumption about his ability to pay and his economic situation. And he ended up being recommended an inferior drug because the presumption was he couldn't afford the more effective but more expensive drug. So that's an example of where economic status can have a huge impact, or the perception thereof, on the kind of care people get. And so we've certainly looked at that as we analyze how we address this as far as our patient population. And there's a whole lot more work to be done there, but undoubtedly it is a significant issue.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think, that's something that, beyond organizations, again, just kind of thinking about healthcare inequities and the disparities in the system, talked about that knowledge piece. That's another piece that, if you weren't aware of those things, definitely encourage you to read a lot of the research that's out there. So, getting back into the data, what I think, maybe could be very helpful is, and I certainly understand not being able to share any specifics about your organization, but perhaps if you can give some suggestions around particular data points to look at, especially around things like inclusion, right? Which can seem very, like nebulous, like what does that even mean? How do we measure that? So if you have any kind of data points for starting points, that you could kind of talk about and suggest to our audience, maybe some experience that you've had, and then also, are there any particular data points you can share that you're using to measure success? So, just kind of understanding, the very specifics around the data collection for this. So I will go ahead and start with Shamika on this.
Yeah. So really good detailed question, right? As we start to peel back the onion on where to make the change. One immediate area I mentioned earlier is just that career velocity piece. And so just to break that down a little bit further, what we are doing across our organization is understanding what is someone's experience trajectory been in the past, how has it kind of unfolded, and then what does it look like it will be based on their previous trajectory, and then how that compares as a baseline when you look at high performers, what the average high performer is able to achieve. Do you see that same level of progression for your Black and Latinx talent when they come in at the junior level, when their first promotion time is? Do they have the right sponsor to then get them the next big opportunity that gives them exposure to the right leaders to even get promoted? And so, as you can imagine, breaking down each of those components require lots of data points. One thing that we've had to really help our leaders think through is, one, everyone has bias, right? It just is what it is. And so if you take a look at just your own dynamic situation and how you engage with people, everyone has bias. but we've asked them to kind of take a step back and say, okay, hey, we're not trying to individually call you out, but what we do want you to consider is, are you looking at how you bring men in and what rate that compares to how you bring in women? So when we look at hires, what is your hiring percentage based on your available hiring pool? Have you minimized your hiring pool, when it comes to gender or other ethnic diversity, because you haven't necessarily spent the time, to go out and expand that hiring pool? So having them look at that data is extremely helpful because they can see what their hire ratio percentages are, as well as where their exits are. And I think the exit data has been extremely helpful, although, what we're encouraging them to do is catch them before they exit, right? Let's make sure we understand these issues now so that we can get in front of this proactively. But historical exit data tells us quite a bit on, are we seeing that, Black and Latinx individuals, for example, are exiting at a certain point in time? Is that because there was a missed promotion, or is that because there was not the performance rating? And so breaking that down further across the organization is always extremely helpful so that leaders can see what is their accountability, where do they line into driving some change. And then inclusion is, I'd say an extremely challenging metric to put your hands around. One way that we do that is through our employee engagement survey. And what we find from an engagement standpoint is that our men and women are actually engaged at roughly the same percentage. And so that's good data to build upon. Where we're trying to dig into further is to see, are there leaders that have higher engagement and inclusion percentages, and what are some of the behaviors that they're doing so that we can share them more broadly across the organization? And so I think intuitively, everyone knows who those leaders are that people just want to work for, right? They're the people that, someone's always clamoring, like, can they be my mentor? Can they be my sponsor? How do we start to create those modeled examples so that other leaders can start to evaluate, okay, I can take on this particular action of, I'm in a meeting, I host a meeting, and I have a few people that don't speak up. How do I bring them into the fold to drive greater inclusion? Many of these things are not hard. They just require an intentional focus on. So inclusion is one that we are continuing to expand out, and we're trying out many options with different service providers and candidly different technologies to see what we can do to drive greater inclusion at an accelerated pace.
Great. And I think, that point about exit interviews, yes, they give fantastic data. And as a starting point, look at those, but getting the leaders to a point where they can catch it before it gets to an exit is definitely, a great point. And, using the engagement survey, right? So a data point that you're already leveraging, for a number of reasons, and then digging into that data. So it's also a bit about like getting creative with what you already have, right? So what are data points we have, and what different lens, have we not looked through to actually, understand where we're at when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you so much. I think that gave, some really great ideas for all of our audience members. So David, would love to hear if you have any kind of, thoughts from your own experience or just suggestions for audience members, about that starting point, and then, measuring that success in any of your initiatives.
Sure. Well, first, I'm jealous listening to Shamika and all the ways they are able to measure this. We are, I think, more immature in our journey around metrics. And I saw, again, on the poll question earlier, a lot of people struggling with data issues. And I guess what I would say there is that we all are on a journey and probably all want more of this quantitative data than we have, but that shouldn't impair us from being able to take some action. I think for us, we're certainly collecting and measuring lots of the types of things that we can measure through our HR systems, and looking at representational diversity, promotions, pay equity, and lots of other things along those lines. But probably the first thing we did was something that I think is just really building on people's sense of their experience. And so we actually just conducted focus groups and just ask our Black employees, what is your experience at Stanford? Do you recommend it to your friends? What are you struggling with? What is it like to be Black at Stanford? And so, when you ask people questions like that, they'll tell you what they feel and what their experience is. Now, we will have some people say, well, that's perception, and maybe the data doesn't bear that out, which is a whole different conversation. But we also do know that perception is reality. And when people have a strongly held belief based on their experience, that's something that you really need to understand, and then start from the presumption that is truth. And now what do we do with that? And so we collected all of this data from these focus groups, where we did go exclusively to our Black employees. And we've now built the whole action plan around responding to the things they said. We identified several themes and opportunity areas, and we're now trying to go back and say, what do we do to correct this? One example of a key area that came out has to do with our whole employee relations function. And we learned that our Black employees believe that our employee relations function doesn't work for them, that they don't get a fair hearing, that whenever they have a complaint of discrimination, it always comes back with no findings, and that they don't believe that the process really gets to the root issues, and that managers are held accountable, or that a lot of the microaggressions that are sometimes difficult to prove can continue to persist because we're not able to really put our finger on it and take action against leaders, where sometimes you have a hard time getting the evidence. And so we've put in a whole series of efforts to completely review and modify our employee relations and investigation function to increase the perception of fairness, to get more diverse folks involved in doing the investigations, to have a review group and a process where these claims have the opportunity to get another lens to look at them, to see whether there's something that was missed in the initial review, and just a lot more clarity of expectations for leaders around their behavior and their accountability for the environment that they create and for what they allow either from their own leadership or within their teams. And so for us, that's probably been one of the most challenging work streams, because we've had to interrogate all of those policies and processes. We've had to reframe how our employee relations team thinks about their role, and many employee relations functions. They are an agent of management, so to speak, trying to help address and mitigate risk and liability for the organization. And sometimes they fall flat in terms of really making the employee feel valued and heard, and that they're going to get a fair hearing. And so we've been going through lots of work there to try to improve that, and also recognizing that often the cases are so highly confidential, you can't even really talk about what happened. And so trying to convince people that you did the right thing when you can't even talk about the details of what's going on is even more challenging. So that's probably been one of our areas of great challenge and perplexity, but it's a commitment that we've made, and we're certainly on the road to improving that perception and that outcome for our total workforce, Black employees in this case in particular.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe those are things that only would have come out in a focus group versus a survey, right? And that's why it's so important to understand your culture, kind of understand, people's level of trust, whether it be in a focus group or in a survey. And, oftentimes the best data comes from those combined. I would love to know, David, that's the type of focus group that you really have to, set up in a very purposeful way to make sure that you've created that space where people feel comfortable, and incredible things came out of it, right? But, I would love to hear just any advice on, if someone wanted to set up a focus group like that, the best way to go about that.
Well, I would say the first thing you need to do is to think seriously about why you're doing it and what you're going to do with what you learn. Because the worst thing you can do is collect a lot of data, ask questions, and then not really know what to do, or maybe not be committed to really doing anything with it. And that's absolutely the worst thing. And also, you can set expectations that become really difficult for you to meet if you're not really going to be prepared to address it. So I would say, before you move into that, take the time to really understand what you're doing and why. Do you have your leaders' engagement and support and sponsorship? Are we actually going to take this seriously and do something with it? And if you can answer yes to all those questions, then I would say that you really should get some professional help, because you want it to be structured appropriately. It should be probably an outside third party, which we used. We hired an outside firm who does this work and who is very skilled in these areas. We wanted both the design of the independent third party, but also the structure around the science of how to engage people in these conversations and questions in order to make them feel comfortable, and then to be able to collect the data and analyze the data most effectively. So that put us in the best position then to have clear, objective data, be able to really understand the themes and the issues, and to be able to put an action plan in place as to how to address it going forward.
Thank you. Shamika, did you want to add anything?
Yeah,
in that
you saw
same
me
line?
nodding my head, I
Yes.
think, right? Yes, I was like, David, I love how you called out. I mean, it's almost, it's as important to communicate what you're not going to do, right, as well as what you are going to do, because I think there's so many companies and everyone is struggling with, how do I make sure that I'm communicating and showing and actually moving the needle in this space internally as well as externally? And getting those messages to coincide is critically important, because that's when it's authentic, right? When your internal employees feel that the same message that you communicated externally applies to them. I did take some quick notes on the employee relationship side, so that the employee relations data piece, because I haven't seen that one pop up for us, but it sounds like one that we should dig into. But I think just being aware of how you move that data forward, how you move the findings, and communicating with the affinity groups has been a really open and honest lessons, kind of lesson learned for us. Making sure that when we bring them to the table, we have those open forums of psychological safety. We have a lot of conversations where they will ask for things and I say, we're not there yet. Let me tell you why, but here's, we're not there yet, but here is the path that we're trying to get to. And it's hard, right? It's hard not to be able to deliver on some of the things that you personally want to deliver on as well, but either systematically, timing wise, or just, culturally, it may take a bit longer to get some of those things done. Having those uncomfortable and hard conversations is just part of what we have to do. But the transparency will help us get there faster. So I do feel like when I, say it's, we're not there yet, but here's what we're going to try to do to get there. And, let's think through this together on how we shift the tide faster. They're always open and willing to help. But it's one of those where we have to have the dialogue of, I can't do everything, but I want to do the most impactful things, for this group and all of our other affinity groups. But I also need your patience and grace as we learn publicly and learn along the way.
Thank you. So, sounds like clear objectives, setting expectations, and the follow-up, are really kind of those key components. So thank you so much for both of you sharing that. In our last few minutes, I wanted to just ask you, we really want everyone to walk away from this feeling empowered. So I'd like to ask, both of you this final question. What is one action each person listening can take away to drive lasting change at their organization? And if anyone, if there are any platform anyone can connect with you with or follow you for more insights, please include that as well. I'm going to go ahead and start with Shamika.
Yeah. So this is always a tough one, right? Because there's so many things you can do, right? And so I think if you think about the fact that we are making headway, most organizations, they understand they probably have a representation problem. But the inclusion part, I think, helps us also with representation. So what I would say is, find an individual. If you're a leader, someone outside of your group, find someone that you can actually sponsor. Because what I see data-wise, what I read as well, shows that when we can engage with bringing someone else along that may look and be different from us, may be in a different part of the world, that helps change that landscape of diversity. when we can truly engage with someone to help them get that exposure and move forward, it starts to change the dynamic. So find someone different from you, find someone maybe that you even disagree with. I had a leader that actually said he selected, a female person to sponsor because she had such varying views from his. And so he just wanted to understand what made her think that way, why his views were so different. And now they have a remarkable relationship, but find someone to sponsor.
Thank you, Shamika. Excellent point. Sponsorship is one of those things that's been found to be very effective in the DEI space. David.
Well, yeah, for me, this has been just a really important question and inquiry and conversation I've had with myself and others since the George Floyd video, asking the question, will this time be different? And I believe personally that it will only be different if each of us has a personal encounter and really makes a personal commitment and really understands where we are, and that we are able to change hearts and minds one person at a time. And I've been fortunate to be able to coach and mentor a lot of people across the country, including CEOs and executives at different companies, colleagues and others. And I had one conversation that really galvanized for me what this is all about and my strongest advice for people about where we are. And this is a CEO, a white man, who hired me back in 2001 to be head of HR for a large Catholic healthcare organization across the Mid-Atlantic. And we worked together for probably 8 years, did some really amazing work. And then he moved on, and he's since retired. Now he lives in Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy. He's a grandparent and really at a stage where he's just enjoying his life. But I reached out to him about a year ago just to check in. And he said, David, I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about you as we're looking at this social justice environment. And he said, the question I've been asking myself is, did I do enough as CEO to lead around inclusion and diversity? You know, what was my record? And did I do everything I could do? And I've been losing sleep over that very question. And I was just really amazed that, this very successful retired white man is losing sleep wondering about his record in diversity and inclusion. And first off, I assured him that he was an amazing leader, one of my favorite bosses. But really more importantly, it made me think about how to frame this for people that I'm now coaching. And so what I tell people is, this is a moment in time in history. And when you look back on this in 10, 15, 20 years, how do you want to answer the question, what did I do with this moment? How do you want to think about and reflect on your impact 20 years out, and take the effort today to do the work that will set you up to be able to answer that question in the way that you would like to answer that question. And so as I talk to leaders in our organization, I frame it for them as a legacy question, and I make it very, very personal. And I think what that does is it takes it beyond just what the boss is going to do, what the organization is going to do, metrics and all that. And it makes it very personal, and it gives every person an opportunity to reflect, think about their own impact and legacy, and make a personal commitment. And I believe that will sustain change over the long haul.
Wow, that's a really powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. And again, we talked earlier about that leadership buy-in. It is that personal connection that so often kind of moves mountains, so to speak, and keeps us all on the path towards sustained change. So thank you so much to both the panelists, David and Shamika. It was so great to have this conversation with you. As a reminder, this session was recorded and will be shared with you via email. If you would like to participate in our Meet the Expert program, getting a fantastic one-to-one opportunity with a collaborative Workday expert on any topic you'd like related to Workday implementations, please see the link in our chat to book your meeting. And finally, please complete the survey at the end of the webinar. We talked about data. We would love to hear your feedback so we can continue to evolve our content, delivering the information that matters most to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, panelists, everyone who tuned in, and have a great rest of your week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.